Today we're going to be working this young Trident maple. It's not quite spring yet, so it's not budded out, but we're going to dig it today, um, cut some off the top, work the roots, get into a pot, and hopefully get it on its way towards being a better tree. Um, Before I start, I wanted to clean off the base of the tree, get an idea of what I'm working with. So I'm just going to remove the leaves off the top of the soil. And once I get these out of the way, I'm going to take a look at the root base. Now I do want to use a pair of tweezers here and kind of rake out and see if there are any surface roots here that we need to try to preserve. A lot of this will be removed, so I'm not especially gentle. Now this tree was planted on top of a small piece of metal um, to kind of give it a better chance of providing that radial root base. So I'm just going to kind of get an idea of where the roots are at the edge of this metal, and when they reach that edge they grew straight down, so those will all have to be removed. So our next step is going to be to try to cut under these roots with the hori hori knife. It's just a Japanese root knife. It's not especially sharp, it's really better for smaller roots. We're going to try to undercut the tree with this, and if it does not work, I do have a small double-bladed saw that we can use instead. So this wasn't quite doing the job, so we're going to use the saw instead. I'm just going to cut right under all of the roots all the way around the tree, and then we should be able to remove it. And the tree's out of the ground now. All that's left for us to do is to rinse off the roots, and then we'll begin removing the downward facing roots and working on potting it. And now we're going to rinse all this extra soil off of the roots so we can get an idea of what the current root base looks like. And then once we get this out of the way and we can see, we'll start removing those downward facing roots. We will cut the top, and then we will put it back into a pot to hopefully grow into a happy tree. So now we can see what we have to work with as far as roots go. You can see a lot of these are growing straight down below the metal. Once they reach the edge, they grew straight down. So there are a lot of these that will need to be removed, the majority of these actually. But Trident maples are very hardy trees. So this is going to look drastic, but it should be just fine. I'm just pointing here to several different spots that will need to be reduced. There's mess of roots here that are crossing, kind of ugly looking, so we'll be cutting these back. And just in general in this area, we'll be cutting back probably 2 inches or so from the trunk. These small roots here will probably be left long, strengthen them so that they may grow and look more in proportion with the rest of the tree. Now we're going to look where we should cut the top of the tree. There are several buds here along the above the branches where it splits, and we'll cut back to one of these. There are some on both sides of the trunk. I'm probably going to err on the side of caution here for dieback, but I really am intending for buds closer to the trunk, and we'll cut back to those probably next year or the year after. Now, when we are making these trunk chops, you have a couple of options. You can use a branch cutter, such as this, on a smaller tree. However, this is the largest that I actually have. You really want the diameter of the branch to be no larger than about a third of this cutting edge. And as you can see, that compared to these branches, it's not quite big enough. So unfortunately, even though I would prefer to have, one easy cut there, we're going to have to use the saw that I used with the roots. Now this is obviously a big no-no. You do not want to use something that's been in the ground or in the dirt exposed to those bacteria on above the ground, or reuse it without sterilizing it. Um, I actually could not find my other root saw, so I had to use this to cut it from the ground. So before I use this to cut the top, I'm going to make sure that I sterilize it pretty well with some alcohol, and we'll give it just a minute to dry, and then it should be okay. I am going to seal these cuts immediately after, so I'm not terribly worried about it. Or this Japanese maple or something like that, I may be a little more cautious, but I'm pretty confident that this will be fine. Now, we're going to hope for buds to break down here close to the trunk after we make these cuts, and we would eventually cut back to one of those. But for now, we're going to cut these two up top, and we'll let it grow out this year and see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and make these first couple of cuts, and I'll be right back with you. I've made my first couple of cuts. Um, the second one, I do not want to injure the bark on the back side, so I'm just going to use this grafting knife, and we're going to try to cut this other edge cleanly. That way there's less injury to the trunk, even though we're really not worried about this part of the tree, in the future. It's still just a good practice to try to make your cuts cleanly if you're able to. Now, as you can see, I'm just trying to get a good angle here. These cuts are actually very clean. There's no need to actually clean up the edges with the grafting knife in this case. So I'm just going to use a little bit of wound sealant. There are about 100 different kinds out there. I have no idea where I got this one from. They all do about the same thing. We're just going to apply just enough to cover the top and the edge of the cambium so that it does not dry out. As you can tell, I did leave roughly half an inch above those nodes just in case there were dieback. That would just kind of prevent or reduce the chance of there actually being that node dying because of this cut. So if I can get a good angle here, we're just going to, like as I said, barely layer on just enough to cover it. We don't need to really pile this stuff on. Some of you may be wondering why the metal under the tree. When it was a seedling, maybe pencil thick, no bigger, I drilled a hole through this metal and threaded the seedling through. As it grew, it grew these nice radial roots over the top. Results may vary, but this is an easy way to get a start on a flat root base. I'm going to use 3 different sizes of branch cutters to start reducing this root mass, trying to get it all on one plane, remove all the downward facing roots, as well as get everything coming out from the trunk at the same level. These are kind of mid-grade tools, or Kanshin and Masakuni tools, but anything that you have is better than nothing. When you use tools like this, you do want to make sure that the edges slightly overlap, and that is just because they work in the same way that scissors do, and if they do not overlap just a tiny bit, they will pinch whatever you're trying to cut, and it won't cut it cleanly. Now I'm planning to reduce these roots in stages, just to prevent going too far at one time, and I'm trying to use the corresponding branch cutter size to the size of the root. As you'll see a little bit later, there are a couple of times here where my largest branch cutter was not quite enough, but I did force it just with the intent of cleaning that cut up with a graft knife after I made the cut. I've now removed enough of the root base for the metal plate that's been under the tree for its entire life to be removed. And when I do, it comes off pretty easily, and you can actually see the scar where the bottom of the tree used to be before it was girdled by the metal plate. So all that remains of the bottom is just a tiny scar. As you can see, that the root base is now pretty flat, and we will reduce these roots just a little further, and it'll be ready to go into a pot. Here's a root that's a little too large for my largest branch cutter, so rather than risk messing it up, I'm going to cut a small notch with this saw and then finish the cut with the branch cutters and clean up the cut with the graft knife as needed. tree's now ready to go into a pot. We have left the smaller roots a little bit longer, so hopefully they will grow a little more vigorously and gain size to be in proportion with the rest of the roots. This soil mix is going to be made up of some cedar bark, we have lava rock, we have pumice, and we have turfus. I'm just using an old cut down nursery pot for this tree. It's obviously in the early stages of development, so we're not trying to put it into anything too fancy. All we're going to do here is add the soil, make a little mound, and I am going to place it on top of the same piece of metal. We're going to add in enough soil to cover the root base, and once we have covered it, we'll get rid of any air pockets with chopsticks. We'll soak the soil, and then we'll add a little bit of moss on top of the soil to help protect any new roots that may try to form, which is, ultimately what we were looking for. Once we've done this, the tree will be ready to grow for probably the entire season and most of next season. It will then be put back in the ground, hopefully with a new leader that is sprouted lower down. But what we've done today is set up this tree for success in the future. It is always a work in progress, but this is something that needed to be done and will need to be done also in the future.